Today I'm speaking with Eric Runge. Eric, thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Did I pronounce your name right there?
Yeah, it's Rungi.
Rung. And I don't know too much about Eric, but we're going to get to know him together. He is in Gladstone, Oregon, a suburb of Portland, and he has a stepson who is 11. He's also the father of two, a 2-year-old, as well as a newborn who is a month old at the time of this recording. So congratulations on your newborn. Are you
Thank you very much.
getting much sleep these days?
Ish. My wife has taken the brunt of it, but yeah, we're working it out.
Hmm. I did want to also mention here as we're getting
Yeah.
started, just to before we get the full bio in, I like to give a trigger warning for my viewers. And most of you come here for the deconversion stories. This is not a deconversion story, and Eric is a Christian. We'll get into that, but I think it's still going to be worth it for those of you who do stay, because we're going to be talking about a topic that's near and dear to my heart, which I've talked about several times on the channel, which is the Doug Wilson Christchurch cult in Moscow, Idaho. But going back to the bio, Eric is the owner of Veritas Wealth Management there in Oregon. It's a financial planning firm, and their mission is to maximize your freedom and maximize your potential, which are important concepts to Eric. They're informed by his Christian faith, which we'll get into shortly. Eric received a degree in music education from the University of Idaho, and he attended Christchurch there in Moscow, Idaho, for 4 years. And during that time, he also taught at Logos School, and he lived in the same house in which New St. Andrews College held classes. So that's what we know about you so far. What else should we know about you?
Well, I'm majorly into Bitcoin. That's a huge passion of mine, and so I'm completely down the rabbit hole as far as I can get. But there's a lot further to get. But I
You
love
like
it, and
mining or
I
just investing?
just investing.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah. Mining is fascinating to me, but that's this whole different thing that I just don't think I have the time or intensity to get into.
Yeah,
But yeah, but I do love Bitcoin.
or the need for a super high electric bill, I've heard, if you start
Yeah,
mining too
right.
much.
Yeah, exactly.
And can you tell us anything else also about yourself that's just kind of something fun, your hobbies or interests?
Hmm. Well, I've been a drummer ever since I was little, and I love going out to jam nights in Portland. Portland's great still for really good music scene, so I love that. And then I like whitewater kayaking. This Pacific Northwest area is really good for that too. We have some world-class rivers up here.
Awesome. That's so fun.
Yeah,
Sounds like some good stuff too, to as your kids grow older, to have teach them how to do all that stuff and partake together.
yeah,
Um,
definitely.
that's awesome. Well, I usually, as people know, I usually at this point ask people to share their stories based on where they're coming from with Christianity. I know you, Eric, you're probably gonna do that in some degree, but this is focused again on your journey relating to the Christchurch group in Idaho. So you feel free to start us off wherever it feels like is
Hmm.
appropriate to be able to share your insights for your experience there.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. I think what I'd like to do is maybe just sort of tell my story in a broad-based overview, and then let you just hit me with questions, drill down, and then just kind of take it from there, see where it goes.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, cool. So I went to Moscow in I think '97. I enrolled at University of Idaho up there, and discovered Christchurch somewhere in that time, like within a year's time, and started going to church there. The people were friendly on the surface, and I say on the surface, I don't mean to imply that it was strictly superficial or that there was an insincerity there. They were legitimately friendly. There was also a sense of we know and you don't, so you're not really worth listening to. So there was a friendly, not friendly sort of element of it. But I went to church there for 4 years and graduated college, got pretty in depth with Christchurch, drank the Kool-Aid, as it were, got into pretty much everything that they taught and were teaching. And I mean, legitimately bought in. The thing that was really appealing to me was that Doug Wilson was a strong character, uh, in the sense of here was somebody who had it all figured out, knew what he believed, knew how to defend the faith, and he was charismatic for sure. And I was looking for that at the time. His strength in terms of like his strong masculinity really appealed to me because he was a leader and he just didn't waver from what it was that he said, and so that was like attractive to me. So I went to church with them for 4 years, and then I graduated college, moved away. Definitely stayed in the Christchurch sort of mindset and model and mode. I was fully convinced that it was 100% right. My belief was that if everybody would just do it like Christchurch, then the whole world would be saved or would convert or usher in the kingdom. And then on the other side of that coin was, you guys are not doing it like Christchurch, so you're kind of dumb. That was a mild way to put it for kind of how I felt about it. And so that was my belief. That's what I held on to for years and years. And periodically I'd call Doug up, ask him theological questions as I was studying through and working through an issue. I always had a belief that if I would become more like Christchurch, that I would find the rest and the peace that I was looking for. There are reasons for that I can talk about a little bit later. That was not actually true by any means, but that's what I thought for a long, long time. So I studied a lot and just try to keep conforming. I would listen to sermons and talks by Doug Wilson. This is all independent. I'm like in Portland at this time. And by the way, my disclaimer is I don't wish Doug Wilson any ill will or harm by any means. I'm not here to sort of get vengeance on him. I don't have an axe to grind. I'm not trying to take him down. I don't think that that's my job, nor do I even think that I can. So anything that I say here is not coming from that place. Frankly, it's coming from a place of if somebody is trying to heal and try to find their way and who they are as a Christian, as an individual, then I want my experience to be of service to them, of help to them.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to it. So then I got married in about 2013, and that was a pretty rocky marriage. By the end of that, what we had done was I wanted to take us back up to Moscow for counsel. I figured Doug was sort of the last line of hope, last line of defense. I felt that he was really insightful from his blog posts on marriage. He said a lot of really wise things, seemed to really have all the answers. And Doug he comes across as if he has all the answers. And so I, in the back of my mind, believed that. I would have never said that out loud. Yeah, Doug has all the answers. But there's a sense in the back of my mind that you sort of believe it, but it's not at the surface, So I acted as such. And what happened was the counsel was terribly shallow and ineffective. It really didn't take into account any of the boots on the ground realities or the human realities of what were going on. It felt very packaged, out of the box, not applicable. So I had trouble kind of swallowing the counsel, but I did it because I felt Doug was right. So I just was going to do it. And then that just didn't work. My gut was correct. It just didn't work at all. And so that right there began the process of deconversion for me. It planted a seed in the back of my head.
And when you say deconversion, could you just clarify what you mean by that?
Deconversion from Doug Wilson, strictly. Okay. Yeah.
And just one other question. The counseling, did you ever determine if they were accredited? Like, I know they've got that whole Jay Adams, Nuthetic stuff, but like, were they actually truly accredited as far as you know, as real counselors?
No, they weren't, and I knew that they weren't. And I still believed at that time that any and all humanistic counseling was of the devil, I guess, as it were, not to make a caricature term, but was not right, sinful, not helpful, could lead you down a bad path. So I was fully on board with, we don't want a accredited counselor. Gotcha. I don't believe that now. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question. So no, they were not accredited. And I think maybe to clarify that for me, what I believe is that people ought to be experts in their field. If you're a bridge builder, you need to be accredited. That's important. And you need to go off of research and science and study and pay attention to what's actually going on. If you simply say, we're just going to do what the Bible says, well, that's not going to help. People are going to die. I still believe in the Bible wholeheartedly, 100%, but I'm not going to turn to the Bible for bridge building. That's not where I'm going to go. I'm going to go to the experts. And I believe the same thing in the field of counseling. There have been people that have said bad things, destructive, wrong things, of course. But you got to use your brain. Anyway, I'm digressing. So anyway, my wife and I ultimately ended up getting divorced after a 5-year marriage. And what happened after that, and now I'm kind of into the overview of my deconversion, but that was the point of that brought me up to today. After that, I called Doug actually and mentioned it to him that we were now divorced. And it was the same thing. I still couldn't get a hearing from him. It was like he was not hearing what I was saying and didn't seem to want to hear it. And that just kind of pushed me further down the road. Anyway, there's a whole process there for me, but I got remarried. My new wife planted some seeds in my mind. She's like, I think you might have been a victim of spiritual abuse here, the way you're talking about this whole thing. And that got me thinking. So I did quite a bit of study on that. I read some books on abuse and abusive men. And then ultimately ended up writing Doug a letter to talk to him about this, to try to sort of get a hearing. And that failed miserably, grandiosely. And that brought me kind of here to where I'm at today.
When you were, just for context, as we dive into some of the details, were you growing up with the same theology as what you found in Christchurch, meaning obviously ultra Calvinistic, the strong Christian nationalism, just the strong patriarchy? Was that typical for what you were used to?
It depends on what you mean by each of those terms. I did not grow up Calvinist. I grew up Arminian. My pastor at my home church said that he was a 4-point Calvinist. And what he meant by that was that limited atonement he didn't believe in or agree with. So no to Calvinism. Christian nationalism, we didn't even think like that when we were kids. What do you mean by that specifically?
Along with the postmillennialism and the Reconstruction theology, that their ultimate goal is to take over the world for Christ, and
okay,
that
no.
is part of ushering in the kingdom.
Okay, got you. No, I definitely was not raised with that. I was raised Baptist, Arminian, dispensationalist.
Okay.
And so that answers all of those. But no postmillennialism, definitely no Reconstructionism.
Yeah. So Christ was going to come when the rapture time was ready. It was going to surprise us all, and we'll meet with him in the air. Okay.
Meet with him in the air, and I was ready for it about that time in the 90s.
Gotcha. Yeah, as I grew up the same way as well. I landed in Calvinism in my last few years as a Christian, but yeah, I definitely was the same way. Calvinism to me was a harsh way of interpreting scripture that I didn't think was appropriate when I was younger, and I certainly didn't have any intention to try to use the government as a way of ushering in the kingdom or ushering in Christian morality. I thought it's just got to be from the heart. There's got to be heart change, not from a judicial sense, but people need to want to do it God's way. So I definitely wasn't in it myself either. As you went from your group to Christchurch, did some of the theology that you saw there, or even some of the practicalities, like pedo baptizing babies, did any of it shock you? Was there a period where you had to adjust to some of the theology, and did you accept it all, or was it more just like, we're different, but we're similar enough that I can still have total communion and enjoy the fellowship? Like, how did that work for you?
That's a tough one. I was like 20 years old, and so a lot of the thinking processes that I've developed as a 46-year-old, I just didn't have in place at the time. So, however, on the other end, the attitude from Christchurch was, and I think still is, this is it. This is the truth. And there's not a ton of grace given. I'm qualifying that. They made fun of evangelicals and mocked them for being more or less stupid idiots at the time. And so there wasn't a lot of room to even think through it or disagree with it. That's on a broad level. Doug was definitely doing that in credenza agenda and from the pulpit. And there was an overall cultural air of, we're smart, and haha, we're smart. And these guys are dumb. And I bought into that big time. And I regret that I did, because I ended up coming home and treating people as a result, but I thought I was doing the right thing. So I didn't have the ability to process it because I was young, but there was also a sense in which I felt it kind of, it was like, this is right, just believe it, that sort of thing. I don't know if I'm doing justice entirely to how Christchurch would think, that they think about that, but there's a sense in which your individual will and freedom to just sort of be yourself and go on your journey, as it were, is not really respected. And I'm talking
Yeah.
about your Christian journey to figure out what you think the Bible says. I'm not talking about your freedom to go do anything that you want unqualified. I'm talking about your Christian journey.
Yeah. And he even
Yeah.
has, like you say, he's got things that he uses to attack other Christians. I remember that book,
Yeah.
the Evangelifish, was one
Oh
of
yeah.
them. The big one I think that was pretty well respected among, even in the broader Christian world. And then his book, Reformed is Not Enough. So
Yeah.
you can be a Christian and reform, but that's not enough. There's got to be, more and more, doing it our way, thinking our way. And I definitely relate to your sentiment about when you went there and then left, you found yourself judging other people. I
Hmm.
went to Bob Jones University for a year. If you're familiar with that school, very,
Is
very,
that Pensacola?
it's very similar. It's not. Bob Jones is
Okay.
in Greenville, South Carolina. Pensacola would ironically consider Bob Jones, at least when I was there, they considered them a little bit liberal because they weren't KJV only, which is
Oh,
crazy to think about this stuff that used to be have any value in my life. But when I first went to Bob Jones, they were pretty strict compared to where I'd grown up with, and it felt restrictive at first. But over that year, the 1 year I was there, I got very used to it and very comfortable. And I found myself doing what you said, where you go back home and you see everyone else who's not really concerned about the same rules and rigidity, and you're kind of mentally judging them like, oh, I guess you're not that serious about your walk with Christ then, huh? And
mhm.
it definitely takes some time to realize the judgmentalism that we can, even if we don't verbalize it, it's just there, and we're just kind of silently
There.
judging them.
Yeah. There's
Hmm.
definitely, I was steaming underneath that they weren't doing it right, like Christchurch. But the thing that hurts my heart about how I sort of behaved back then is that these were the people growing up that loved me unconditionally my whole life, the sweetest Christian people I had ever met. And if I go back to my hometown Madras, that's who I'm talking about. They're still the sweetest Christian people I've ever met. And I treated them really badly. And so I feel sad about it. I don't even think they remember because they're really sweet people and they would still treat me really, with a lot of unconditional love. But I brought that harshness, that harsh serrated edge from Christchurch before I even knew what the serrated edge was. I brought that with me. So I mean, you go through life, you learn, and you learn from your mistakes and errors and things. But that's a period of my life that I wish I could. You know how you think I wish I could go back in time, knowing what I know now. That's if I could go back in time, that would be the one.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely can do that. Well, I know we're going to go a little bit more into your story in a minute, but I did want to ask just for context too, since we're talking about some of the things that Doug puts out there publicly, his
Mhm.
books, his blog, his videos, and so forth, Canon Press, and all that. With all the stuff that Doug produces, one of the things that I began to realize, even as a Christian, if I remember correctly, was just seeing a very caustic attack mode from him, especially toward two groups. Number one, homosexuals, and number two, towards progressive Christians. The whole Rachel Held Evans battle that they went back and forth over. Basically, you're an idiot. No, you're an idiot. I'm like, all right, let's tone it down a little bit. This is kind of crazy. And but especially, even after she passed, he kept on attacking homosexuals. But it wasn't just like, I disagree with your sexual choices and your stance on these things. It's like, I am opposed to you on the deepest level. Like, you're my enemy, and I'm not just going to proclaim you as my enemy. I'm going to make fun of you. I'm going to mock you. And I think, I
Mhm.
don't know for sure what all the philosophy is behind that, but I'd imagine that just like Christ supposedly called the Pharisees a brood of vipers and whitewashed tombstones, things like that, where you're allowed to name call in certain places when you're talking about ultra hypocrites and ultra enemies of the kingdom. Name calling is appropriate. Christ did it. Um,
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
I would assume that might be part of the mentality to say, well, if I'm going to be like Christ, the name calling is not out of the question to occasionally do. But he would do it in a very obnoxious way to homosexuals. Um, and I don't have it in front of me, but there's things where he would be calling people by horrendous slurs and different names that just
Small
were very
breasted biddies.
inappropriate. And a
Yeah.
lot of,
Lumberjack types.
yeah,
Mhm.
lumberjack dykes, and a lot of names for women that just kind of put them in this secondary level of like, you're just not that important. And then when I saw a lot of concerns coming up later about his sex robot book and his other stuff, I'm like, there's some real issues here against with sexual issues and against women. Did you see that? My question is, with all that intro, did you
Mm.
see that? Did you notice it? Did it come up on your radar? And if so, how did you respond then? And if it didn't come up to later, how would you respond today, knowing that that's out there?
Uh, yeah. So did I see it assumes it was there in the format that you've stated it. And I don't think that it was there in the format that you've stated it. However, having said that, I come at that from a totally different angle. Um, yes, it's there. You talked about his sort of caustic attitude. You described it as obnoxious, and I would describe it as sort of Mr. Right attitude, or we know and you don't. Um, See, I don't think Doug is a misogynist. Um, I don't think that it is restricted to a given sex. I think I'll start by telling you my story and how I experienced it up there, how I felt and what I saw, and then how I generalize that to try to figure out exactly what's going on. I always felt that I was a sexual wolf when I was up there in their presence. Now, I'm not saying that I believed that. I'm saying that image was sort of thrust on me. Not me personally, sort of generally speaking, that men cannot be out with women, after midnight, or men cannot be alone with women, because the sense was there's sort of this ravenous sexual wolf that will just come after them and hurt these poor innocent girls. And then, like, for example, the way that Doug writes in Fidelity, the book on sexual purity for men, he's pretty critical, pretty shaming and kind of belittling in some areas. And that made me just feel kind of gross and dirty. If I had sinned sexually, that sort of thing, like, oh, I'm just gross. And it made me feel that everybody else around me was clean and that I was dirty. Now, I've heard women say that about their experience with Christchurch as well. But I had the exact same experience. That's why I say it's not relegated to a given sex. Doug does it to everybody. And I think that
Hmm.
it comes from his attitude of it's sort of a Puritan attitude of holier than thou, elitism, we know and you don't, that sort of thing. I would put it, see, I don't think Doug is a racist. I don't think he's a misogynist. I think it's something different than that. But the abuses that people complain about, I do think are real.
Hmm. Speaking of abuses, there's been a lot of individual stories that have come through there over the
Yeah.
years of people who have um, said that there were situations where he was called to be involved, where there was someone who abused someone else, and that in many of them, there was a chance to really step up and protect the abused and to make sure the
Mhm.
abuser was separated out, not allowed to do any further damage. And instead of doing that, that the dynamic is pretty evident in some of these cases that it looks at least from an outsider's perspective that he's protecting the abuser, and that
Mhm.
the abused actually gets further attacked after the first abuse happened, but attacked by the church leadership. Did you
Mhm.
get um, any sense that that was happening when you were there? And did you know any of the stories close enough to know if that was possibly an accurate way to describe it, or like what was your exposure to
Yeah.
those situations?
Well, the same thing happened to me actually. So when I was there in the late '90s, I was blissfully unaware of any of that, with the exception of there was an implied threat that if you went against Christchurch, or sort of did not went against, but if you didn't conform, there was a sense of being cast out or socially shamed, that sort of thing. But I was on their good side at the time, and I never pushed it, nor did I even care to. I didn't even think about it. When I came back, I was actually harassed and pressured and threatened by one of the um, elders, Mike Lawyer. And so that was my taste of being on Christchurch's bad side. And the sense that I got from them, although nobody ever came out and said it, was that I was the abuser. Um, and so I was hurting my wife, doing awful things to her. but nobody really said what it was that I was doing, and they never came out with any specifics or charges. But what I what happened was, I guess I should maybe just tell the story. Would that be all right?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. So I have no intention of throwing my ex-wife under the bus, but I kind of have to say she was abusive. I don't know how to say that without saying it.
Yeah.
What I can say is that they thought I was abusive. And that's that.
Sure.
So I guess I'll tell you this. My story on that is I got the taste of being on Christchurch's bad side when we did go up there for counsel, in like 2017, 2018. And I'll just kind of tell the story. Mike Lawyer, was slated to pick me up from the airport, which he did. So what happened was my wife, she was up there on her own, counseling with Doug and Nancy. And I was in Central Oregon, which is 2 hours away from my home in Portland, visiting my family. And I get a call from Doug that there's been a medical issue. You need to come up. And so I sort of hurriedly make plans. I got to be up there the next morning. So it's a rough night. I don't sleep well. I'm kind of stressed, but I get up the next morning, get on an airplane and fly up, and Mike Lawyer's going to pick me up. And so he picks me up, from the airport. And when we get in the car, now he's a counselor, and I still had him in my mind as a category, put into the category of counselors are empathetic. They hear you, they listen to you, they understand. They may or may not agree, but they are at least sweet. He lays into me almost immediately when we get in the car, before we even left the airport, and is kind of thrashing me, saying, if you are deliberately making life hard for your wife so that she will leave you, that's hard-hearted and wicked. You need to be excommunicated by your church, which was Reformation Covenant Church in Oregon City, which is also a CREC church. So they're sister churches. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. He's just kind of laying into me, and I'm going, hold on, back off, back off. And I don't remember any of the other content of that discussion. I just remember that. And then I remember finally the only way that I could get him to back off was to say, you're really misunderstanding me here. And Lawyer at the time was in the middle of some kind of a debacle where he was feeling super misunderstood. And so what he said was, well, I know how that feels. I don't like that. And so he backed off. But that was upsetting. That hurt to kind of be run over the top of. And then later what happened was he was trying to force me into going to counseling with him, me and my wife and I at the time. And he would not take no for an answer. So I get to Moscow, and I get into, the hospital room where my wife was. And the doctor and I and her came up with a plan where she needs rest. She's been through some stuff. She just needs some alone time. And I said, oh, cool. I'll just go to town and get her prescriptions. That'll give her some downtime, that sort of thing. And the doctor said, yeah, no visitors, nobody in here. Cool. So I go to town, and I see Lawyer and this other elder from Portland that had come up, also against my will. He came up, and I asked him not to, but he did anyway. Those guys were hanging out, and I needed to talk to Mike for some reason. I cannot remember. And he was just relentlessly trying to force me, to go to counseling with him. And I said, well, no, we're here to counsel with Doug. We don't even live here. 2 counselings at the same time don't really make sense. And he just wouldn't let off. And I remember thinking, what do I do with this guy? I'd never been treated like that or seen anybody behave like that in my life. He was just relentless. The other thing that happened at that time was that I said, no, you guys don't go into her hospital room. They expressed a desire to visit. And I said, don't do that. The doctor said not to do it. Give her some time. And that was the way that ended. And I was still feeling really just overrun by Lawyer. And so I called Doug, from the Safeway parking lot there in Moscow. And I go, I don't know what to do. These guys are at me and they won't let off. I'm trying to come up here and help my wife, and it's just madness. And he goes, and I'll never forget this. He goes, just tell him I said to knock it off. And that was the end of that. I go, okay, that was the end of the call. So Mike Lawyer is now texting me. And what he's saying is things to me like, you're at the edge of the point of no return in your marriage. If you don't back off, and stop this path that you're going down, your marriage is going to fail. And I didn't even know what path he's talking about. He didn't say any specifics. And I go, Doug says to knock it off. And he goes, boom, backs off right now. The other elder basically said, I don't answer to Doug. I can do what I want. And he kept at me. So I got a 50% reduction, you know.
That's crazy.
And so it's crazy. It was madness. And I looked up later, like stalking laws. And I don't think it really violates stalking laws, but I think it definitely violates harassment laws, where you just tell someone to knock it off and they quit. And then the interesting thing was, just as a side note about that, I later came across a story from a woman who had the same thing happen with Jim Wilson, Doug's father, where she was in the middle of a divorce, trying to get away from a husband that was, she says, is treating her horribly. And Jim wouldn't lay off. He like followed her. She kept moving and he kept finding her new addresses, and she would say, back off, back off. And so I took from that there is this sense of the eldership is the monarchy, and they have full reign over their people, even anybody in their presence who are not their congregants. I was not under Christchurch's jurisdiction. I was under Reformation Covenant Church's jurisdiction. So that's the reason that I tell that story, is because you had asked about them sanctioning abuse, as it were, or protecting the abuser, and then the abused person gets the treatment. My experience is, if they think that you are bad, they'll lay into you. But oftentimes they don't do their research to figure it out. And there's just not a lot of questions asked. My take on it is, there is a similarity of thinking with Doug Wilson and Christchurch and his elders to actual abusers. They think in the same categories and the same terms. And so you can't see, if you can't see your own sin, you're not going to see it in somebody else, right? And so I think they do end up covering for abusers. I'm not saying that they do it self-consciously, but I think that it ends up happening. And I think that the abused end up taking it in shorts, as it were, a lot of times.
Yeah. I was just going to add, I've had people that I've tried to interview about Christchurch, and I had one person I remember a couple of years ago where they were very scared of what was happening and the threatening part of it. And they told me that they literally had a drone that would follow them. They'd go to the park and it would follow them all around town. And they had to basically, for the sake of their own sense of well-being and safety, just move out of the area. I've heard I've had several people say something similar, that it just didn't feel like they were safe there. Obviously, some people, it's not as much about that. It's more the issue of the shunning. I've had people tell me that Christchurch people just wouldn't acknowledge them anymore. They just, they'd see them in the grocery store and just turn around, not talk to them anymore, things like that. But it feels like whatever part of that spectrum you're on, if you kind of alluded to, if you're on their bad list, it's definitely a punishment and some way of, it feels like it's, and again, I'm an outsider in many ways, but it feels like it's this sense too, like, look, we're the authority, we're God's authority here in this church, in this town. We're speaking for God in a certain sense, obviously not like ex cathedra, but they're not the Pope.
It's a pseudo ex cathedra.
Yeah, but like we're God's authority in your life. And so if you don't listen to us, the option isn't, well, I'm going to go find another spiritual leader that I can, I think they've got a better perspective, so I'm going to let them be my authority. It's like, no, God's put you here. He's made us the authority. If you don't listen to us, you're not just bucking us, you're directly bucking God, and you need to understand there's going to be consequences.
Yes, I think you nailed it. I don't think I could have come up with that on my own, but when you say that, it gives me a sense of like scary authoritarian chills, and that nails the attitude. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, did you ever come across anyone else that I know there's stories out there that we can all read, but did you personally ever come across anyone that you spoke to that would say, yeah, I actually had something similar happen to me?
Not in the specific examples that you just gave, but I do have one friend who was there with me at the time and who shares a very similar sentiment. And he got FOG'd a long time ago, Fellowship of the Grievance. He had the guts to ask questions long before, when I was still just sort of conforming. So my answer is yes. I don't believe that Christchurch says directly let the abuser keep doing his thing. Obviously, they're not going to say that out loud, and I don't even think that Doug Wilson believes that. They're not going to spot the abuser, is the whole point. And so the abuser's going to have cover, frankly, because these guys don't go that deep, and they're so into the nouthetic mindset that they don't think they have to go deep. They're pretty easy to trick by the manipulative sort. And Doug Wilson can be manipulative himself. So there's that as well.
Can I ask on that note, you bring up a really important topic that I wanted to ask about at some point, so I'll squeeze it in here. When you look at stories like the Jamin White situation, or the Steven Sittler situation and a few others, you get these abusers that you would think everybody would say, wow, like that's really, really, really bad. We need to protect the innocent people here and make sure that the wolves are not allowed to get near the flock. But it flipped, and as I've read a lot of different articles over the years and gotten a sense of how they hopefully I'm getting a little sense of what they're actually thinking. It's not thinking I appreciate, but I'm trying to understand where they're coming from. It seems like a big piece of this is the idea that, like, look, if you're a Christian, what does that mean? A Christian means you believe that God takes an unregenerate, evil heart that is willing to hurt people and is willing to do horrible things and be completely selfish. And God is going to come into this dead heart that is wicked because you're born in Adam, and wicked because you choose wickedness, but this wicked heart. And God is going to regenerate you and give you a faith to believe. And at the cross and the resurrection, you are becoming a new person. In baptism, you're buried and you're risen. If Romans talks about you're a new creation, your mind is being renewed. If you are a Christian, then by definition, what you're saying is, I know that this whole experience that I'm going through as a Christian, someone who was not saved when I was born, of course, but now I'm a Christian, is that God looked at me, condemned my sin, and said, you have no way to forgive yourself. You have no way to be right, but I am going to provide the solution for you through Christ, through atonement. And if you are truly a Christian, you're a new creation. The old things are past, everything is new. And therefore, the whole idea is you're ultra forgiven and you are a new person. Therefore, if God says that about you, you're a new person in God's sight, you're forgiven in God's sight, you have fellowship with God, then who are we to do any less? And if God has restored you, we're for sure going to restore you too. And the theology, I think, is I get where it's coming from, but I think they're missing this piece of saying, well, even if we believe that God forgives people, there's still some dangerous people. People who are pedophiles shouldn't probably be near children. People who are, whatever the issue is, or if they, their word sin, whatever the sin of the day is that they're looking at with this situation, that's a situation. If there's someone who's on the extreme and they're clearly hurting people that's their life. Their life shows an extreme trend of hurting people horribly. That person probably should not be exposed to our church, or at least that there should be incredible amounts of protection for a church from such a person. My question then is, do you think that is an accurate way to see it, that the theology of the ultra forgiveness given through the gospel is what's causing them to not take some of these abusers as seriously? Because that would imply the Spirit can kind of regenerate you, but he can't actually really transform you. That's why we have to protect you from the flock, or protect the flock from you, because the Spirit really doesn't have that much power to change you. The Spirit has some to, definitely get you to heaven, but the Spirit can't change you here and make you safe with children. The Spirit can't make you safe enough to not beat the shit out of your wife. So, you know what I mean? Like, the Spirit is only going to go so far. And if you admit that, if you were to add that, you're like, well, then we're talking about a God who's not powerful. And the gospel is all about power. He's here to transform your life. Do you think that's part of this?
I don't think that the theology that you named is driving it. And I'll tell you why in a second. I don't think that Doug would say that God is not powerful to change. I think that he would say the opposite. And what I've read from his stuff is that by the grace of God, this thing is possible. That's a quote at the end of Fidelity. The ultra forgiveness part, like, I have no problem with that because, I mean, go watch a movie, go watch The Walking Dead when that guy when Carol killed that guy's girlfriend. And that, I don't know, it's like season 4-ish, and there's this tension throughout the entire series that these two are hanging out together, and finally she comes clean and says, I killed your girlfriend. And this guy sits there forever, and he looks up at her and he goes, I forgive you. And so, and everybody just melts at that. So this notion of forgiveness is resonant within the human soul. There's something that we all cheer at that point. Atheist, Christian, I don't care. Everybody loves that kind of a story, I think. So I don't think that that's the problem. But what I was thinking when you were talking about that was, yeah, the scripture teaches that, but it also teaches us to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. You have to be wise. So I would place the trouble at the nouthetic counseling point of view, which is essentially says that just obey the Bible, more or less, just obey the Bible. We don't need humanistic counseling. We don't need to go deep. We don't need research on the brain to understand, humans and how we function and operate. Just obey, for crying out loud. Would you just obey? And it's sort of a frustrated approach. It's extremely shallow, and so they never go deep. And that kind of comes back to my point of, if we approach bridge building like that, people are going to die. You don't approach any other academic discipline in the world in that way. You need to be a specialist in humans. And so if you're not a specialist in bridge building, you're going to be pretty easy to trick by somebody who wants to come along and manipulate you. It's the same way. You're going to be pretty easy to trick by a manipulator. These guys who are manipulators are good. They've been doing it their whole lives. They're skilled and polished at it. And there's a level of, evil that does not look evil. It looks sweet. It looks like a victim. It looks like, oh, I just screwed up. And you have to be able to discern and go deeper. And I'm riffing a bit off of Peter Leithart's apology there, because he said as much. He's like, look, dude tricked me. I was shallow. I didn't think it through enough, and I should have. And I used to think, when I was sold on Doug Wilson, I used to think Peter was kind of a dum-dum for saying that. But as I've deconverted, I see exactly what he meant. He says White tricked him, and that's that. So I get it.
Yeah. I do just want to clarify one thing. I love what you said about forgiveness resonating with us. And I remember when I was much younger, some story, I'm from Pennsylvania, and I went to finished up my bachelor's degree at Lancaster Bible College, which is in central Pennsylvania and Amish country. And there was a story that when I was, I think, just about the middle of my time there at LBC, where somebody had gone to one of those Amish schools where it's like, everybody from like, grade 5 to 12 is all in the same building. But some crazy guy had gone in there with, all kinds of guns, and of course Amish are, it's just like one teacher or something and a bunch of students. Came in, barricaded the door, and just took out a bunch of students. I mean, crazy bad situation.
Whoa.
And I remember watching the news like that night, the leaders of the Amish community coming on and saying, our main message to the world is we forgive you, to that man.
Wow.
And I agree with you. It does resonate. But at the same time, there's this sense of we can forgive someone, but have really solid boundaries. Like, for example,
yes,
if that, to piggyback off the Walking Dead story, and I've seen a little bit of that, but I haven't seen it all. But say there was a movie where somebody had been a child molester, and they came to, the person that they had molested, and maybe years later, and said, "I'm really sorry. What I did was wrong." That person that was the victim certainly has the choice at that point to forgive, or in my opinion, to not forgive and to never forgive. I know that the Bible talks about if you don't forgive, you won't go to heaven. But I think it's appropriate for someone to say, I don't forgive you, period. Like, I don't want to ever talk about it again with you. I'm done with you. Forgiveness will never be offered. And I think that's appropriate for some people. But if in this, going off of the story you mentioned, if someone says, yeah, actually, I do forgive you. I forgive you for what you did. That's fine. That's their choice. But at the same point, the victim wouldn't say, well, would you now become my children's godparent?
Yeah,
Or would
yeah,
you come babysit my kids next weekend? You're going to know that that person could be forgiven, but the boundaries would have to be pretty extreme.
yeah.
Do you think that they have that level of understanding at Christchurch on a leadership level, that there are people that you can say, we forgive you, but you're damn sure not going to get near our young girls as a possibility to, we're not going to marry them off to you, or whatever. Do you think they connect those dots?
It's hard. I get it. I get what you're saying, because I've seen Doug write that, and I can't get into the Sittler or the White case much because I was not there, and so I have to plead agnosticism because I just flat don't know the details. But I have seen Wilson specifically say what you just said of, yeah, there's such a thing as forgiveness, and then there's also such a thing as boundaries. So you ain't going to let the dude babysit your kid the day after. And he took steps to, keep Sittler at the edge of the congregation. He had to have a person chaperoning and that sort of thing. I really don't. I see what you're saying. There's an implicit contradiction then to marry that dude off to a woman in the congregation. I guess my commentary on that, where I could speak, is that Wilson has a belief, and he articulates it in Fidelity, that sex solves an awful lot of the problems in marriage, a lot of the sexual temptations and a lot of the problems in an almost sort of magic way, kind of. Therefore, it follows, if you believe that, logically, that to marry a child molester off, or somebody who has been a child molester who has repented or supposedly repented, off to somebody, that's going to really help solve their problems. The problem with that, in my view, is it gets back to the bridge builder analogy. There are things going on in a person's mind more than simply sexual temptation that causes them to want to molest children and take advantage of vulnerable people. It's not simply you can just obey the Bible. It is just obey the Bible, but it's way, way deeper than that. And so that nouthetic mindset, I think, in part at least, drives that sort of behavior, where then you see Sittler admits that he had thoughts about his kid or whatever. And it's a tragic situation because you have to take into account this notion of father hunger that Doug Wilson has introduced to us, which is a pretty darn good thing, a good notion. It's not a good thing, father hunger. It's good to be aware of. Now that kid doesn't really have a father, so that's heartbreaking. So yeah, I think Doug needs to start thinking deeper. Is my whole thing, and start taking the Bible a little bit more seriously. Frankly,
I did want to ask at this point too, just in terms of your experience from what you observed and what you know of the different situations, a lot of people would be really concerned about Doug Wilson in the sense of the toxicity that we've touched on a little bit, but also there's some other messaging that's going on here. It relates to him being in part like an isolationist, it seems, at least from the outside, very elitist. I think we touched on before, it's our message, it's our way of the highway. It does remind me, I say this tongue in cheek, but it's not totally off. It feels a little bit like a mafia boss situation, or mob boss situation, whichever one was more appropriate. It's like, this is the Godfather kind of situation happening. And I think a lot of people, even Christians, are observing, this feels cultish. This feels like there's some inconsistencies that are very concerning. There's some cult-like behavior. So number one, would you agree that Christchurch is cultish? And if so, what did that look like in your experience?
That's a really good question, and scary and in-depth and insightful all at once. Let me tell you this, and I'll lead into it. When I got remarried, I was with my wife, and we were in dark, rainy Portland, middle of winter, and we're heading to the movies one night. We're driving in the car, and I was telling her about that story about Mike Lawyer. And I had a lot of fear just kind of show up right then. And I go, I feel like I'm not supposed to be talking about this. Like I'm breaking a rule or something, and like somebody's going to come and get me. And she said something that's totally surprised me. She goes, I think you were a victim of spiritual abuse. And it just blew my mind that could be possible. I'm like, is that possible? No, Christchurch. But I started looking into it, and I read some books on it, including this book most recently called Why Does He Do That? By this guy named, I think, Lundy Bancroft. Excellent book for understanding abuse and abusive men. So that was my foray into thinking this through. Why do I feel so afraid, first of all? And I've also heard stories of people who have moved away half a country away and are still terrified of Doug Wilson and what he might do or could do. In my mind, there was an implicit threat that I didn't know exactly what it was, but it goes back to what you were saying before. I believed these men spoke for God. And so if the men who spoke in place of Christ would then excommunicate me if they could get their hands on me, doesn't it logically follow that Christ is waiting at the end of my life to tell me, depart from me, I never knew you? And that scared me really badly. But I started thinking, well, let's find out if that's true or not. I had a friend that said, he's a faithful, believing Christian. He goes, yeah, well, the Roman Church said stuff like that too before the Reformation. And I'm like, oh, okay. But Doug Wilson can't be wrong. So I started thinking it through, and I ultimately came to the conclusion that, yeah, they're pretty cultish. There's a strong element of control, of even of mind control, of sort of brainwashing, as it were, but not the caricatured type that you see with Jim Jones or Charles Manson.
Yeah.
It's much more mainstream mind control. But yeah, I definitely think that it's there. The implicit threat is a pretty important part. I think there's a few points of it that I've thought through and sort of written down. There's definitely the we know you don't attitude is there, and that begins getting you to question yourself. And the fact that you're not accepted, like your knowledge is not good enough because it's not their knowledge and it's not on board with their community. And so it's sort of dismissed and poo-pooed and even made fun of. That for me had the effect of de-individuating me, of making me second guess my own self and my own identity. And the sense that I got was that I basically just needed to become like Doug Wilson, become like them. So Doug also overtly says, drink the Kool-Aid, acquiesce, sort of the way I would word it is hand over your consent. Don't think, just do. So there's the sense in which conformity is just expected. And they don't seem as concerned of, well, do you actually agree with that? Go process that. Go think it out. Come back. What do you think? What do you think the Bible says? Why? It's not that sort of an open back and forth. It's more of a, like you kind of said, a rigid authoritarian, just do it. And what's the problem? That I don't think Doug himself, if you talk to him personally, would have that attitude. I've never experienced that from him per se, but that's definitely the vibe of the culture. Christchurch is also, yeah, go ahead.
Do you get the sense that some of the issues are just that everybody, like you mentioned the word culture, that everybody's doing it? And so there's like there can be like an unspoken pressure to just conform to some of these things where it's like, you know, they may not necessarily be saying, do this, think that, but we all are doing that. We're all thinking that. So if you step out of line, you just look you look like an outsider by definition.
Yeah. Yeah. A really good example, practical, of that for me was, you know how Christchurch is into this sort of old England, old Europe, medieval religion culture sort of thing.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I would go skateboarding when I was up there towards the end of my time. And my roommates would make fun of me for doing that. And they were fully into Christchurch. One of them became a pastor, and he's still a pastor up there. It was like, haha, you idiot. You're going to do stuff that the world does. You probably go to the mall too, huh? You're dumb. It was that attitude. So yeah, it's there and it's subtle.
I wasn't aware of some of that mentality. Like what things, just very, very practically, would they would they actually say stuff like "Don't go to the mall," or is that just being exaggerating? But like, what things are you typically not allowed to do if you're part of that group?
It doesn't go as overtly as you're not allowed, because that would be legalism. There's no written set of rules. It's this unwritten set of rules that's hard exactly to put your finger on. I think that it ultimately is rooted in, if you are an independent agent and you are yourself, uninhibited, you're going to be suppressed. If your individual personality comes out, you're going to be suppressed. That is my experience. Anytime I've really tried to let myself out up there, I get mocked, scorned, made fun of. And it comes off in little subtle ways. It's a little glance, a look, that sort of attitude. It's just conformity. I don't come from a place of conformity. I come from a family of cowboys and rebels. And I have fun stories I could tell about my family, rebelling against legitimate tyranny and bad authority. So I've always been myself, and you just can't. I'll just say it. I'm not going to qualify it. You cannot really be yourself up there. That's what it is.
It's interesting. I remember definitely. Again, I can relate to some of what you're referring to in a different context. Bob Jones was definitely that. Their rule book was probably a couple volumes long of do this, don't do that, and don't do this at this hour. And you couldn't be caught with a girl after sundown. Even just walking, just happen to be walking together at the same time. Just there you are. Well, if you're going this way, I'll go this way too, and we'll talk. Sorry, if it's after sundown, you cannot talk to her. Lots of rules. But yeah, definitely. And when I was at Lancaster Bible College, which is much more liberal comparatively, much more liberal, they still were like, don't go to movies, like don't go to the movie theater. I'm pretty confident they've changed on some of that stuff since I was there, but the rule book was definitely pretty significant for how you conduct your life.
Yeah, definitely. And as you were talking, I was reminded of one, an actual out and out, very strong guideline was when they would have these balls up there, and you would do traditional dances, the Virginia reel and all kind of traditional folk dancing. It was really fun. But one of the rules was a man cannot ask a woman to dance, I think, more than twice, lest he lead her on and awaken love before its time, and thus run the risk of breaking her heart. And mind you, these are not dances where you're dancing junior high style one-on-one intimately. These are dances where I pick my partner and then I don't see her again until the end of the dance. And I might see her in passing, hey, how you doing? And then so that was one of the
English
rules.
contra dancing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, traditional like that. Yeah. And so this idea of extreme protection of women from the men, man, that was rough, because again, I didn't mean anything by it. So I don't know. It was just harsh. Anyway.
Well, it's a good time too then with that in mind to ask this question: is patriarchy an issue there in your opinion?
Define patriarchy. What do you mean by that?
Women need to be, by and large, silent in the churches. The authority structure is God, the church, men, women, children. Men are the voice for God, as it were, in the church, and certainly, for the most part, in the community and government. Men should be ruling, women should be supporting.
Yes and no. The Bible is obviously, I'm a Christian, so I believe in the Bible without qualification, without exception. The Bible is very clear that it says, wives, submit to your own husband. And so that language is clear in Scripture. However, it's important to note, how is it being done? So your question was, is patriarchy one of the driving issues? Patriarchy in and of itself, if it simply means kind of men are running things, it really depends. It really depends. I don't think patriarchy is the issue. I think the harsh, rigid, shallow, nouthetic mindset, and I'm not name calling, I'm using quick shorthand terms. That is the issue. And I'll tell you why. I experienced the same abuse up there that women have complained about as well, but I'm a man. And so it can't be patriarchy in the sense that a lot of people want to say that it is, or else I would have felt like I was a king up there. But I didn't feel like that. I felt suppressed, scared, threatened, that sort of thing. So I think it's broader than simply that.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, and I think if we were to dive into patriarchy in general, I think you and I would be on very different pages with that topic. So I'll leave
Sure.
leave that one for another day.
Yeah, that's fine.
The issue then next of you mentioned you felt like you were suppressed with, and you've talked a little bit about how people can't really have divergent ideas. How is someone typically going to respond in that community as far as you're aware? Like, let's say they have a different theology. Let's pick a couple things. Say paedobaptism. I don't believe in baptizing children. Okay. I don't want to do this specific rule. Say there's the way that they just typically do things. I don't want to follow that rule. I want to go to the mall. I want to watch an R-rated movie, whatever it is. Do Christians who especially maybe grew up in Christchurch or are kind of heavily enmeshed in it, do they feel the need to pretty much just pick a different church at that point because they're never really going to be looked at favorably? And like, what would happen if Christchurch as a leadership level got the sense that you were kind of, chattering to people, I don't really agree with this, I don't really agree with that, I think I might need to pick a different church? Would they shun people like that, ostracize them? Like, what would be the response if you're starting to take steps to say, this might not be my church anymore, you all just don't feel like my people anymore, honestly? How would they respond to that?
It's hard for me to answer that because I don't know their specific process. I've never gone through that process. I was in full conformity, obedience, or whatever when I was there. I don't know their process. I'm sure they have it all written out for how they would do it. I do know that I've heard Doug Wilson say that if somebody comes, and he was given a hypothetical, if somebody comes into the church and say they're Lutheran and they're sort of propagating Lutheran ideas, that they're going to come and say, I think it's time you found a different church. What I know is the sense that I got is sort of, it's a vibe of conform or else. And like you said before, God has put you here in this church. These are your elders. It's a sense of sort of you're trapped. To which my response would now be, well, but God's about to put me someplace else and you ain't going to be my elders. So what about that? How is that consistent with what you're saying? I don't think that they would say, well, then God, it's clearly God's providence. He's put you there and you need to conform. No, it's the manner of speaking to sort of evoke conformity. What the consequences are for lack of conformity ranges anywhere from Fellowship of the Grievance, which is a group of people who have a problem with Doug Wilson, rightly or wrongly, whatever, to potentially excommunication, I guess. All I know was the implicit threats always felt like that. That's about as far as I could go in answering your question.
Gotcha. You mentioned the word discrepancies before. What discrepancies would you say you saw in Doug Wilson and the leadership there?
Discrepancy meaning like contradictions?
Yeah, either contradictions, but define it and contextualize it how you want. I was thinking of it in terms of contradictions of them versus other Christians, as well as self-contradictions where they say one thing but do something else. But if you meant something different by it, feel free to take it the direction you want.
Yeah, it's really two different questions. I mean, what I know is that Doug Wilson's style of Christianity does not fill you with fountains of love. When you get there, there's a surface level, yeah, love is good, God is love, that sort of thing. But there's a deeper message that you have not lived up to God. He's kind of perpetually unhappy with you. That's the message that's never overtly stated, but it's the vibe. Your identity is not good enough. You need to conform your identity to that of other Christians. You don't get to be yourself. None of that's loving. It doesn't let you just exist. So you end up feeling like you have not performed well enough and you can't just sit and rest. One of the things that I remember Doug Wilson saying one time is when the Protestant Reformation broke out, it was a great relief to the Protestants. And he was obviously identifying himself with that Protestant religion. And I remember thinking in the back of my mind, then why don't I feel any relief? That was just one of the little tiny seeds that I had planted in my mind. And then the answer is because you're doing something wrong. And so it's this perpetual treadmill, and you just can't get off it until you finally get off it. So that's the answer there. I believe Doug Wilson's religion contradicts Christianity itself, which is a loving, kind faith. It's not a gooey faith of people with no backbones in its true form, but it's also not nothing but serrated edge. And that's more or less what you get, at least more or less how I feel, how I felt treated. The other side, you probably have a million questions on that, but the other side of that is in terms of contradictions, just objective contradictions. We could spend the rest of the time talking about this, but a few of them, Doug Wilson is super libertarian when it comes to resisting the government, but then authoritarian when it comes to people resisting him. So this notion of individual rights goes out the window, and it's rules for me and not for thee. Rules for thee and not for me. That's a contradiction. You either have individual rights or you don't. God-given individual rights. If you've got them, and according to the founding documents of our country, you're endowed with certain inalienable rights, then you have them. As far as you cannot be, a church man cannot then tell you drink the Kool-Aid, acquiesce. Those rights stick, right? That's a contradiction. One that I have really tried to think through, and I've actually never mentioned this out loud to anybody, but it's what I would call it the Puritan Confederate contradiction. Okay, I'll give the disclaimer. All of the Civil War issues aside, slavery, states' rights, let's just let those be debated another day, right? We know that Doug Wilson has objectively stated that the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Grant was like a tragedy. And was like the end of, I can't remember the end of something, but the end of something great. And at the same
antebellum,
time,
antebellum,
the Old South.
Yeah.
Yep. But at the same time, Doug Wilson very openly considers himself a Puritan. He's called his wife Nancy a Puritan gem. And so actually, because of Doug Wilson's influence, I've studied a ton of Civil War history. I happen to be something of a Civil War history buff. And so what I did was I started looking up Civil War history from the perspective of the Southerner. And again, all those issues aside, slavery, states' rights, forget them for a sec. What I found is that the South and the North had dramatically different ideologies, cultures, and even religions, worldviews. It was a clash of worldview is what it was. And the South did not take kindly to the Northern Yankee / Puritan mindset. And so where I'm going with this, and the reason, I'll just say the reason is that they found him ungenerous, elitist, authoritarian. As I started reading some of this history, it just kept popping up. Holy cow, that sounds like Doug Wilson. And then I thought, he calls himself a Puritan, so there's that. Then what I remembered is that actually a talk from Steve Wilkins, one of his fellow cronies, pastors. Steve said that Puritanism in its harsh excesses produced Unitarianism. And then I take it from there, Unitarianism produced Yankeeism. And then the Yankees, from Doug's point of view, came down, invaded the South, and destroyed the U.S. Constitution, destroyed the last vestiges of Christianity in our country. So Doug wants to be a Confederate sympathizer for that reason, but at the same time wants to be a Puritan. And he can't have it both ways because it's a clash of worldviews, big time. But Doug doesn't take any steps to resolve that or even point that out. So I think that's a pretty major contradiction. I mean, you could say defines the heart and soul of the divide in our country. And you cannot, anybody with a brain in their heads can see you cannot be on both sides of the debate, And I'm not saying Doug Wilson doesn't have a brain. I'm not trying to insult him by saying that. I'm simply saying you're going to have to go deeper at some point and deal with some of this stuff. So,
yeah. I think I would side with the people who would say that whether there's a discrepancy there that he needs to deal with or not, just the stuff that he says about slavery being one of the best situations for the slaves ever, it's just unconscionable. I mean, it's absolutely unconscionable, some of the stuff that he said there, and I'm horrified along with a lot of other people at his stance on slavery in the South. I really, there's a lot of things that I hope die out in the generations to come. Obviously, I won't live to see them, but there's some ideas that I hope to see die out. I definitely hope that the idea dies out as soon as possible, that slavery was ever a good thing and ever acceptable. Definitely breaks my heart to think that people, especially people of color, would ever have to hear someone give that kind of speech or see it in a book or a blog like he gives. Horrifies me. Anyway, move on from that topic.
Sure.
When you look at people in that group, there's a lot of people who would seem to indicate that it is kind of the best. We've talked about that a little bit, but I've heard people say, "Oh, our women are the most beautiful in the world." That concept. Just there's people that would literally look at this and say, "You guys are seeing it completely backwards. This is like, if you want to get as metaphorically close to Eden as you're going to get, this is it. This is the Garden of Eden in terms of Christianity. This is a great place." Why do you think people who are in it can't see the toxicity and the red flags? I mean, I know obviously people do. Some of them see it very clearly eventually, and they leave and they become very vocal. But a lot of people would say, "This, you guys are all misunderstanding it." And even like I remember that there was that forget which news group it was, but there was a lady that came from probably New York City to do a news interview with Doug like a year ago, and basically saying, "There's all these people raising all these concerns. Are these legitimate?" And it seemed to me like when he was doing the interview, he was like, "No, they're all felt like the Wizard and the Wizard of Oz. There's nothing there to look at. Don't look behind the curtain. It's all fine.
Yeah.
Like, this is a great place. They're all exaggerations. They're misrepresentations." And it really seems weird to me that people who are in it, they don't just seem to endure it. They seem to thrive in it. Why do you think that is?
I would disagree that they're thriving. God bless them.
Well, that they really like it. They strongly support it, even if they're not thriving.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. I mean, that was me when I was up there for sure. I'll tell you this. Here's my story of that. That was one of the strongholds in my mind that kept me attached. Isn't this the greatest culture? They've recovered Christianity. It's a Christian culture. My wife and I, my current wife and I, we actually traveled down south. We actually did a deep south trip because I wanted to see. I'm of the mindset that I'm not just going to believe what I'm told from any side of things. I'm going to look it up and research it myself. And I've learned a lot doing that. I wanted to find out if the South really was what everybody said it was. So we go down there. And what happened was, it was actually Tallahassee, Florida, that we were in, which is in the Panhandle, northern Florida, and they call that a southern city. They say it's actually really a part of Georgia. It's not Florida. It's the old South or whatever. And the people were the sweetest that I have ever met ever. And I come from Oregon, out west, up in Moscow's even further north. But what I experienced, and it broke loose in my head, is, oh man, this culture is fantastic down here. People are really sweet. And then it made me question, oh, maybe Doug doesn't have the best culture. That's my experience and story of how I sort of broke free from what I'll call the propaganda of we have the best culture up here. And Doug obviously pitches it. We have barbecues and we have dances in the streets. And when I hear dancing in the streets, I'm like, no, Christchurch people don't get down. God bless them. They just don't. That is not allowed. It's not a free, easy, open culture where you can be who you want and individual rights are respected. That's just not how it is up there. I can tell you from my point of view, I cannot speak to anybody else of what's going on in their mind and heart. What I can tell you is I did not have a strong father growing up. And I was not well trained in how to suss out somebody who was not going to do what was best for me or who was going to do me, in other words. I just didn't have a filter for it. Now, what's ironic is my stepdad had a filter for it and saw Doug Wilson early on and just never even bought in. He tells a story about how Doug snubbed him one time because he could kind of tell that he wasn't buying into what my stepdad was not buying into Doug, and he just got the sense that Doug didn't have much use for him. So my stepdad never ever bought in, but I did, because I had some kind of a need or a hunger or whatever. And so I believed that it was the best, because that's what I was told. I was in a vulnerable point in my life. I was a stranger in a strange land. I didn't have an experience of anything different. It was my first time away from home. Having traveled all around the world, all around the country, having met all kinds of people, I can now tell that, objectively speaking, no, it's not the best culture in the world. And I would not ever want to go back. It's a harsh place. It's rough. I just don't, that's not the Christianity that I want to have. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my story about that.
Yeah. I wanted to go back for a second to a couple of things that are kind of side questions to some of the topics we talked about. One of them with women and the topic of submission, as well as the topic of just courtship that goes in there. I know it's a big deal, like you said, protect the women, but then also hopefully get married young and have lots of babies. And I've heard that there is an issue with, it may not be directly from leadership by any stretch, but just an issue in that culture that says marriage is a place where rape is not really possible. Marital rape is not a thing. I think it was Nancy Wilson quoted as something on the lines of, "A man is not trespassing in his own garden." Do you know, do you have any sense that that is an issue? Do people either, I don't know if they'd actually say this, because if they got quoted, they would probably get seen in a poor light somewhere, but you think there's a cultural sense of women can't say no even to their husbands, in terms of, especially with sexuality?
Again, it's like yes and no. I know in Doug Wilson's book, Infidelity, that he quoted scripture where it said, the woman belongs to the husband and the husband belongs to the woman, or to the wife. He didn't say the wife belongs to the husband and it's one way. He said that they both belong to each other. So they can't tell each other no. That issue of marital rape was never discussed or talked about by the culture at large back when I was going to church there. So I could not speak directly to it from my direct experience. All I could do was be an outside observer. And so I have to plead somewhat of ignorance on that. I just don't know enough to really be able to comment.
Yeah.
As far as kind of what they teach.
Just taking it away from Christchurch for 1 second, do you think it's appropriate for, does a woman have the right to say no to her husband sexually if she feels unsafe, either emotionally or in any other way? Does a woman have the right to deprive her husband sexually?
To deprive him? I'll tell you this. There are so many factors there to answer. Maybe this will clear it up. Here's what I think. If a husband is abusing his wife, let's say that he's beaten her up, and he won't quit, and there's no help for her, and she goes to the elders, she goes to the cops, it just ain't no family, then she ought to take a frying pan and wait until he's sleeping and smash him over the head with it. That's what I think. Because a woman has a right to defend herself, just like a man has a right to defend himself from somebody coming into his house, trying to steal his stuff or hurt his family. I think women need to be protected, and that's not condescending toward women. I think they need to be cared for and looked after and protected and taught. See, the feminist crowd is going to freak out at that when I say that. Women need to stand up for themselves. That is what I'm trying to say. I believe in submission. I do not believe in subservience. One of the most obnoxious things to me in the world is subservience of women to their husbands. I want a wife who is a co-equal, who frankly will tell me when I'm wrong, because I need her to advise me. I need her to have eyes on the back of my head. If you've got a husband who is demanding sex when there is clearly an issue in the marriage that needs to be sorted, that's a major, major problem. And he's getting into frying pan territory, in my opinion. I can tell you my mom was married to a guy from whom I get my last name. It's not my real dad. And she would say that anytime she was sick, he was abusive to no end. Anytime she was sick, he would want sex. It was just like a thing, a trigger. That's obviously abusive and is taking advantage of the vulnerable. I got a real problem with men taking advantage of vulnerability and exploiting it. So that's my answer to that.
Do you feel in a more broad sense that women feel empowered at Christchurch or unempowered?
I don't think anybody feels empowered.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Just the idea of, I think it's one of the things that a lot of people who have gone through the journey that I have, which is to not just say Christchurch is a cult, but to say any version, all Christianity is a cult, all of it, any progressive to ultra, whatever, to Catholicism, any of it's all a cult. But people who've gone through that route would say when they're finally out, they'd say, one of the things that I'm doing as part of my healing from religious trauma is realizing I didn't have a voice this whole time. And it might have not have been that someone ever said, I am telling you, be quiet, you have no voice. People might have even said, we want your voice. We want your voice in the choir. We want you to preach whatever. We want you to speak. We want your voice, but it's the voice within very strict parameters. It's kind of like if you have a bookshelf and there's, 1,000 books on it. And someone says, you do as much research as you want to, but within these 3 books. You're like, but there's 1,000 books. Yeah, but we'll do as much research as you want, but these 3 books only. Yeah. And so there's like a somewhat of a voice, but it's within very strict parameters. And I've gotten the sense from what I've seen is that a lot of people, especially women, feel like they need to be quiet and let the men do the talking, let the men do the leading. And then, like you said, there's also some men that get caught up in that, where if they're not truly bowing their knee to the leadership of Christchurch, that they also need to fall in line and kind of, be quiet and let the leaders speak at that point. Do you feel like they have an issue as a cultish group to say, like, look, we're not empowering people, and especially with the idea of divergent ideas, certainly divergent beliefs, like, you mentioned, you want your wife to be speaking. Like, what if someone wants to be a complementarian, like a strong complementarian? And, that the idea, I don't think that they really preach that there. And like, what if that's what you're convicted of, even if you're still a Christian, but you're convicted that's the right way to see this, is that I don't think my husband is above me. I think it's yes. I think, and some people say this, I think the text is saying, yes, I submit to him, but also he has to submit to me. We mutually submit to each other. I obviously I don't care one bit. I think the book is mythology, but for those who like it, it's like, we're supposed to submit together. And if Doug said, no, yeah, you submit to each other in a sense, but men are still in charge. There's a clear ranking of authorities. If somebody said, I don't feel like that's true, do they have a voice, or does it just pretty much just get squashed? And I know I'm using one example, and there's probably dozens we could go into, but are people allowed to have a voice in this, and especially women?
Well, I think I don't think that the notion itself of having a voice, the way that you're kind of saying that, is a thing at Christchurch. Take that issue and just set that aside for a minute. The deeper issue is there such a thing as a voice? Meaning, are individual rights respected? And my answer is not really. The rights of the elders as sort of metaphoric monarchs are respected, and the right of Doug as the sort of king monarch is respected. So it's authoritarian in that sense. And does the individual have the opportunity to think this through and come up with their own conclusions based on their own free choices? My answer is I don't think so. I never got the sense that was the case with me. And so I think maybe what you're asking is, could somebody introduce egalitarianism as an idea into the church, and are they open to it? Meaning that sort of a second wave feminism ideology, right? Well, no, they're not open to that. No Christian conservative denomination is going to be open to that and maintain their conservative Christian denominational stance. If they were open to it, then they would shift into the category of being sort of PC USA liberal. So that in and of itself is not bad to say we have borders. Everybody has borders. We believe what we believe. We don't believe what we don't believe. I think part of the attack on Christianity is to say, hey, you Christians, you believe in Christianity, therefore you're bad. And my answer is, well, I'm a Christian. That's, hit me with your best shot. I'm a Christian. I believe Christian stuff. So it's like yes and no. What I don't think is Christian about it is that very heavy-handed top-down, I know you don't, I say you do mindset and attitude. I don't think Christ had that attitude. In fact, what I think Christ did was lambaste the Pharisees for that attitude. So if Doug wants to use a serrated edge, I think he had to use it on himself. And the thing that I would want to say about that, about women having a voice, is something that's been really important to my wife and I in my current marriage is the way she was raised in a pretty hippie, left-leaning type family. She was actually raised to not have a voice. And so one thing they didn't actively say, you don't get a voice, but there's a lot of things happening that caused that to be suppressed. And so one of the things that I have really wanted to help her with is how to become more assertive. And I tell her, you need to come out and just tell me what you want. Tell me what you're thinking. I need that. And I believe that is informed by my Christianity, not the opposite. So like I kind of mentioned it before, but I find subservience utterly obnoxious. And I don't think that my current wife is subservient or ever was, but it's highly important to me to have somebody who is going to be shoulder to shoulder right there beside me. I don't think that that's inconsistent with my Christian faith by any means. It kind of drives. It's the protection of women and the building up of women, because the Bible says that love builds up, and the word that it uses is the same way that a builder builds a house. What I don't think happens is that people leave Christchurch built up. I sure didn't, and I've had to heal and undo a whole lot of stuff to be built up the way the Bible says.
Yeah, I definitely think it's awesome that you all are trying to do that in your marriage. I do obviously disagree that Christianity does that for people, but
Sure.
we'll save that disagreement for another day.
We'll do it another time over beers.
Yeah. In terms of just maybe to wrap it up, for those who've gone through this, where they've gone through, maybe they're not necessarily in the limelight of some big scandal, they're just on the sidelines, but they've had a bad taste put in their mouth from this group, all the way up to the people where it's like it's a really big deal, and everybody knows their name because of something that happened. As people move away from this, a lot of people give the same ultimate message, which is, this felt toxic and now I need to heal. So kind of a final wrap-up question might be, how have you healed from this? What were the important things for you to do to say, this is not the way I thrive. This did not lead to my feeling like I was at the happiest, most joyful point of my life. This was obviously, the opposite. How do people heal from that? And for the people that truly, maybe they still want Christianity, they want Christ, they still love the Bible, but they want to feel safe in their own skin again. And this really kind of ripped their heart out. And just kind of like, I would easily say Christianity broke my heart. Maybe they wouldn't agree with that, but they would say Christchurch. They definitely hurt me a lot, and they broke my heart. For people that are moving past that and they're saying, I can't go back, that's not in the cards, I'm done, I'm moving on, either physically or at least emotionally. How do they heal? How do they start to say, I'm back on the same, back to the good parts of life? Because for a lot of people, it feels like it's not easy, it's not quick, there's a lot of steps to this, and maybe a roundabout addition to that. Do you think that there are people who can heal from some of this and still stay there, and maybe it's not going to be toxic for them, where they're going to be able to say, I see the bad stuff there and I've healed from it, I've acknowledged it, I healed from it, but there's also a darn good bunch of people that I love, and they're good, and they're I can take the good and I can leave the bad, but I can still fellowship with them and be part of the congregation, even be a member. Like, how would you see that? You can answer those whatever order you want to, but how would you see the healing process, and how would you see someone who acknowledges that it's bad, but they still want to stay connected?
That's a tough one. I really think people can do what they want and should do what they want. So if somebody says, yeah, it didn't really bug me that bad, I see where that sucks, but I'm cool. I mean, I have a friend who I love dearly. He's in the same business and the same company that I started with in '05 from a business point of view. And it's kind of the same thing. It just doesn't seem to affect him as much, rolls off his back. I think everybody has to make that decision for themselves, definitely. And for those who want out, who are either on the front end of it and starting to have an inkling that something's not right, or who are on the other end but can't get the grip released, as it were, or somewhere in the middle, I can tell my story about healing, and that's all I can do. I can't prescribe for them what they need to do. They need to figure it out, and they will. The thing I would say is, first of all, that feeling of abnormality, that something's wrong with me, it's not true. I think this is very normal. This is a very normal reaction to that kind of treatment. A person is not isolated. Second, what I can tell you is I actually ended up getting myself a humanistic counselor, of all people. And right there,
not a Christian?
Not a Christian by any means. Right there, if there's any Christchurch people I got hanging on the edge, I just lost them. Because humanistic, bad. But this guy respects my Christianity. I've, in fact, really never been respected by a man like this, other than my own grandpa and my stepdad. Showed me unconditional respect, as this guy does. And we flat out disagree. And we say it that we disagree. So what he did, he's a specialist, though, and he's excellent. And what he did was he taught me that when abuse happens, it has the effect of separating a person from themselves. And that's why I use the term de-individuate. Before, people don't have a sense of their own self anymore. They have a sense of an invading self, another self, that's making all the decisions for them. Just ask Doug. It's in the videos. Ask Doug what the answer is. And so what I learned is that's a pretty normal response to being treated in an unloving, unbiblical way. If I was going to say this to Doug, that's a normal response, being treated in an unbiblical way, the way that you treat people. So what he has helped me to do is sort of reconnect with my own self. First of all, know that it's okay to be a self, be myself, and I don't need to be afraid of that person. I mean, if the Holy Spirit has saved me and made me a new creation, I don't need to be afraid of that self. And there is this sense in Christchurch that if you are yourself, that is a fundamentally wicked, core level, totally depraved self. But that's another contradiction, because that's not what the Bible says. You were totally depraved, you got saved, and now you're a new creation. So if you're a new creation, you just go ahead and be yourself, and then God will do the rest. His process has been that of helping me to sort of re-individuate and figure out who I am, what I want. And it's given me a humanistic bent. That's why my value proposition is maximize your freedom, maximize your potential, because I would want to be treated that way. Somebody helping me to do those things for myself. That's my passion. And so the humanistic bent has actually been considerably helpful for me, because I think God made us humans. And so you shouldn't try to escape being human. The right kind of humanism is a Christian discipline, in my opinion. And after all, Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't just say, love God with all your heart. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. So there's a God-oriented and a human-oriented element to what Jesus says is the greatest commandment, which Doug would, of course, agree with. And you don't need to be a capital H humanist and go off the deep end, as it were, and I'm using kind of Doug's language, into a secularism, unbelieving, that sort of thing. There's a lot more safety there. If the Holy Spirit has us, he's not letting go of us. He has us. So we're safe to figure out who we are as people.
But it's probably obvious to anyone that's a regular viewer of mine that I'm holding my tongue, and I've got a lot I would say.
You're holding the reins back. I can tell.
But I definitely want to keep the main point as the main point, which is, of course, yes, we do strongly disagree on some of the most basic levels. But what we're here to say is that high controlling cults do a lot of damage. and a lot of people get caught in a lot of crossfire. A lot of people get caught in direct collateral damage here, and there's a lot of hurt people. There's a lot of people that have been wounded in this church. Not everyone. Some people say it's the greatest place on earth, and some people hope it lasts forever and expands. And those of us on the outside who see it for what it is, in my opinion, who see it as very much a place where some really bad ideas are growing and marinating and probably getting ready for the next level, which I think is going to be much worse, as they get into more political power, merge that with their spiritual power. There's a lot of things that a lot of us on the outside are very concerned about. And I think we at least agree that cults need to be held accountable, and that people need to be aware, who are, maybe looking into this, saying, oh, I think I might go to that church or move to that city and join that group, to be fully aware of what's happening there, so you're fully informed. Obviously, people are going to go there if they want to go there and become part of it if they want to. But it's kind of like my story with Christianity, where I would say, look, if people want to be Christians, that's their choice. It's your life. Do with it what you want. But I went through my life as a Christian for 40 plus years, not knowing the bare bones. And I was neck deep in theology books, listening to Christian radio nonstop, went to Bible college, went to a graduate school to be a Bible translator. Amazing people that I thought at the time were just telling me, pouring everything into me. And what got me fully deconverted from Christianity, all of it, was the sense of saying, there's a lot more that you haven't been told. And some people have probably actively deceived you. Some people just probably they didn't know either. But either way, there's information that you need to know. Do with it what you want. And I ate that up, obviously. I wanted to know. I was a researcher at heart. And a lot of that I'm going to be sharing over time on this channel. But, carrying that through even to groups that are still Christian, to say, look, if you want to be part of this group, if you want to live there, whatever, just understand there's some dynamics there that a lot of people are saying are very toxic, a lot of red flags, and a lot of people have been hurt. They feel manipulated. They feel like they've been controlled. They feel like there's probably some sincere people in the mix there. But when you look at the isolationism, the elitism, and again, that mafia motif, it's our way or the highway. There's some ways in which there's some very serious concerns that people have raised. And a lot of people literally have to leave, and they have to leave the area because they feel so unsafe. And I think at least we can agree the people who want to be part of this group should be fully informed about what some other people are saying about it. And
Yes.
I hope that people do take that seriously who are looking into this group.
I totally agree with you. And I wish somebody would have said that to me so that I could have eyes wide open going in as a kid. And I will offer some encouragement to you, because I don't, you mentioned the sort of next generation as they get more political power and that sort of thing. From my study of cults, I don't actually think that's going to happen. And here's why. Doug Wilson's going to be dead and gone someday. And he's the engine driving the thing, in my opinion. The whole thing is going to take a different shape altogether once he's out of the picture. I don't think that it's the threat that people are concerned that it is.
Do you think they'll be infighting for who's going to take the reins, or do you think they'll just kind of try to carry on the status quo and do things as if he was still with them at that point?
I don't know. I'm in the investment business, and my crystal ball broke years ago. So
it's a good idea. Yeah, I hear you. Who knows?
Who knows? It's fun to speculate, but again, I don't have any bitterness, nor do I wish them ill will. Frankly, I actually wish that Doug would convert over to what I think. I think it would be a much sweeter place, and I honestly, I mentioned at the beginning, I'm into Bitcoin. I think fiat currency is the culprit of a lot of the hurt and heartache and trouble that we have in our world right now, and I want what's best for the world to come into a much sweeter, more peaceful place. And I want that for them too. I want it for everybody. It's my heart and my passion. So no, I want what is best for Christchurch, definitely.
Yeah. I think just my 2 cents too is if he did ever, to use a Christian word, repent, either of his version of Christianity or if he fully escaped, either way, he's got a lot to apologize for to a lot of people. And a lot of people, I think, would, that would be a very interesting situation. But again, like you said, there's no crystal ball. Who knows what's going to happen? but he's got a lot to be held accountable for, in my opinion, and a lot of apologies to issue. But hopefully people will see it for what it is and hopefully make better informed decisions based on the information. But I know I've kept you for a while, and we obviously could go through a lot more questions, and we could certainly start debating Christianity. But either way, I just wanted to say I really appreciate your willingness to share some of your story. And there's more to come.
Yeah.
Maybe we can do a follow-up at some point. But
Sure.
I appreciate the willingness to at least get the ball rolling. And I appreciate your willingness to I feel like you've been one of the people that has kind of, you're clearly not trying to tear it all down. You're not just saying, go in there and just burn the place down. There's nothing good there. Even though perhaps I might take more of that perspective. But
You come in with your flamethrower.
Yeah, well, at least proverbially. But the idea of you're trying to say, yes, there's some bad stuff, but it's not all, it's not all bad. Either way, wherever you land on that, I appreciate the fact that you're willing to be honest with the parts that were bad, because there are people that are not even willing to go that far. So thank you for being willing to be vulnerable and share the parts that you feel are concerning. And I feel like hopefully if people do watch this, that they're coming away with a little bit more education, and hopefully asking some better questions, some more pointed questions before they actually join that group. But I know I've
Sure.
spoken a lot here in the last few minutes, but is there any other wrap-up comments you wanted to add before we finish up?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate you having me on as well. I appreciate your graciousness. It's been truly fun. I've really enjoyed it. I would do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again for your time, and congratulations again on the newborn. Hope you all get some sleep soon. And I'll just finish up by saying, everyone, we've been speaking with Eric Runge. Eric, thank you so much. Great to get to know you. Great to hear your story.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.